You've written a lot about the ways the model minority stereotype applied to Asian Canadians is in a way the flip side of the old yellow peril theme of the period before the 1960s. I read a recent article by Aiko Day who said, we can see that yellow perilism and the model minority stereotype function as complementary aspects of the same form of racialization in which economic efficiency is the basis for violent exclusion or assimilation. So can you elaborate on the connection between what might appear to be very contradictory sets of stereotypes about Asian Canadians? And to what extent has this contradictory discourse worked to divide the racialized themselves, with the so-called model minority encouraged to pride itself on its supposed superiority over others?
Yeah, thank you. First, thanks very much for this opportunity to have this conversation, and thank you everyone who has made time to join in on nice sunny days or maybe rainy days somewhere. So thanks for coming. So yeah, in terms of your question, Ian, I think on the surface, the yellow peril and the model minority seems like oppositional categories or stereotypes, but as you quoted the author, I think they are rightly so, as it is said, as you mentioned in the article, complementary aspects of the same form of racialization. And the racialization of Asian Canadians as model minority is intimately associated with the relative historical and social positions of Caucasian Canadians, Black Canadians, and Indigenous peoples in Canada. So if you look back in terms of the 19th century, you have the first Chinese settlement in Canada, in British Columbia, as a result of the gold rush, right? So you have large Chinese immigrants who are recruited to perform much of the labor-intensive agricultural work, other local industry and commercial work, much of the work that white laboring classes were not willing to perform. And then with the Canadian Pacific Railway, again, you have the government actively recruiting Chinese laborers to come in. But soon after the completion of the CPR, agitation began in terms of the Chinese as needed for labor, but not quite right for citizenship. And so there is this momentum to get them out, or at least stop further immigration. And it's something that I found with my research, that the Chinese are not in the late 19th century seen just as an economic threat, who are taking the typical argument with immigrants, they're taking our jobs, right? So there is the economic threat because they are setting up restaurants, laundries, etc. at the time, but also seen as too different in terms of their bodies, too different in terms of their cultural practices, living habits, etc. But the most important thing that I found, interestingly, in relation to the current context, is that they are seen as a health risk. The Chinese are seen as diseased bodies, and they're seen as public health risk. So the racialization of Chinese Canadians was not simply a matter of legal exclusion or labor exploitation, but also public health policies played a key role in the racialization and sort of this stereotype of the yellow peril. With the 1960s, you see the shift from the yellow peril to the model minority, right? The discourse that we are most familiar with. But again, what is interesting, that it's in the 1960s with the 1965 US Immigration Act, when you have the liberalization of immigration policies in Canada, 1970s, right? You have this new stereotype emerging as the model minority. But what is interesting is these are new groups of immigrants coming in, often not laboring classes, middle class, upper class, Asian migration. And also the 1960s is the era of civil rights. So here are African Americans demanding greater rights, demanding an end to discriminatory policies. And then you have the model minority now being defined against the bad minority. So the assumption that, if you work hard enough and you can pull up by your bootstrings and you can sort of rise up to the surface, and the Black Americans are not working hard enough. They are not, doing what the model minority is doing. So you have this, racialization and hierarchization within the racialized minorities, right? So definitely, I mean, the time when this term came into existence is therefore, important to see. And who are they being compared to? So I was looking at some of the 1960s first articles which mentioned the word model minority, and all of those articles always end by comparing either Japanese Americans or Chinese Americans to Black Americans. So that seems to be the refrain, that what you're being defined against, not just white Caucasians, but minorities racialized within. Yeah.
As an historian, I really appreciate the emphasis you place on history. And I think your point is that in a crisis like this, these fault lines are just coming to the surface. And if we don't realize the depth of this history, the weight of this history, we're always going to be just responding to superficially to a crisis, not with any historical depth, right? I mean, I think some people would say, what evidence have you got that this is really still up and running the same way? But
well, read the news.
Read the news, I know. It's like, I mean, that really strikes me too. One of the things I really liked about your piece is how the term Asian American or Asian Canadian is in a sense a confection of the 1960s itself, isn't it? And for someone who is very prejudiced, basically they don't really discriminate between one Asian. I mean, Asia is a vast, huge area. It's with a huge diversity of cultures. But in the eyes of somebody who is a xenophobe, it's all basically just wiped out. Is that what you would say?
Absolutely. Like if you think of, I'm just thinking of, the 1982, beating up of Vincent Chin, right? Which, most folks are aware of. So he is beaten up by white auto workers, and he's a Chinese American who's constantly called a Jap, right? So to the white gaze, Japanese, Taiwanese, Philippines, it doesn't matter. To the mainstream gaze, it seems Asian. And we saw that with COVID-19, right? So the discrimination, the exclusions that we saw with the global pandemic are not just against Chinese Americans, right? If you think of, what happened in Atlanta, Filipinos, right? In another context, some of the Hamilton Spectator news reports where it was a Thai man, Japanese men, right? So again, all Asians are viewed as a monolith. You forget the class differences, you forget the geographical differences, right? Age, gender, all of that. There are so many intersectional identities that create this sort of Asian subject, which is heterogeneous. Yeah.
I really like what you wrote about China and appealing to this idea of sinophobia, which is like heightened fear of China or things associated with China. And you write, heightened Western anxieties around China's large population size, global economic growth, and rapid technological scientific innovation is compounded by China's political system that is considered antithetical to the democratic West. Thus, even in the early coverage of the pandemic, numerous articles noted that China's lockdown and quarantine measures, while effective, could never be implemented in Western liberal democracies such as Canada. So I was wondering, to what extent do you think anti-Asian prejudice has been fed not just by age-old yellow peril-ism, but a kind of new Cold War that is coming upon us, in which the Chinese are being depicted as sort of the monstrous other, not just their regime, but Chinese civilization as a whole is being othered?
Yeah, I think I would start by saying that, it is a global competition between two superpowers, and therefore it involves episodic confrontation and show of might and power, right? So the US administration introduces tariffs on Chinese imports, saying that the Chinese is stealing US technology and intellectual property. China retaliates with its own tariffs. The Trump administration, as we know, has asked that foreign-made telecommunication equipment should not be used because it threatens, national security. We know that, Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson, without any evidence, claimed that the US military has brought the virus to China. Trump claims it's a Chinese virus, right? Repeatedly, even after the World Health Organization best practices dissuade us from assigning viruses to places and ethnicities. And then we know sort of the effects of that in terms of the intense escalation of anti-Asian racism that it created both in the United States and in Canada. So I think it's a tug of war.
Yeah.
And and it's like two of my children, and they're bickering, right? Like, you hit me hard, can I hit you harder?
Right.
And that seems to be the case. So but the difficulty is that these kinds of continual show of power and retaliation against each other produces fears of the foreigner within, right, of Asian Canadians on Asian Americans, and puts them on the edge.
I don't know what you think, but I'm really taken by how much metaphors of war and militarism are suffusing even discussions about the virus itself, which is seen as an invading force. And I don't know if you're going to do any of that with your stuff, but it's really interesting to watch how even supposedly objective reports about the virus start drifting into a very militarized vocabulary. And I'm also wondering about the lab leak theory that's been broadcast all around the world about how it leaked out of a Chinese lab. The whole zeal to say, well, this is a Chinese lab. It is in a way. It was also had extensive American funding, right? It's in many ways, it seems to me like COVID-19 is a story in which national boundaries don't matter as much as global supply chains. And had Wuhan not been within a global supply chain, we would probably never experienced COVID-19. It's the supply chain element, but in the zeal to make it all about warring nation states, we're really kind of misrepresenting reality, which is it's happening within an interconnected world.
So true. Yeah.
I noticed, I really like what you said about the race baiting of Dr. Theresa Tam, Canada's chief medical officer. And you notice Derek Sloan, the Conservative candidate, who actually asked, does she work for Canada or for China, in his most ominous sort of tone of voice. And yet you also critique the mass media admiring comments about Dr. Tam because they kept playing up how graciously she responded to this race baiting. And you write, such reporting of the graceful response to racism works to successfully downplay concerns about structural racism, individualizes racist experiences, does not prompt calls for structural change, does not encourage Asian Canadians to publicly express their anger, grievance, or suffering. What future changes might this anger, grievance, and suffering generate? Might we expect less polite responses to such race baiting in the future?
I'm glad you brought this up because, to me, reading the media coverage, brought up the image of the ideal, minority, the model minority who not just works hard, but works hard keeping their head down. Right. And because, Theresa Tam's, response to that, she said something like, I'm just not distracted by noise. I have work to do. Right. Like, so, I'm not going to get into this. I have work to do. So I think, anger or grievance or suffering can be mobilized for all kinds of reasons, right? To call out discriminatory practices and policies to transform ourselves and our communities. And anger can be marshaled for justice, right? To create multiracial alliance and solidarity. And one of the essays that I read that a long time ago for a very different project that I was doing, which was on India and sort of the cultivation of hate and anger against minorities in India. And this is Audre Lorde, African queer feminist, who has this essay. It was a 1981 essay called Uses of Anger. And in that, she made it, what I find really instructive is that she made a distinction between anger and hatred. So she said, anger is a grief of distortions between peers, and the object of anger is change. The object of anger is transformation. But hatred is about destruction, about death, and it is taken up by those who do not share our goals. So I think I find that really, really instructive in thinking of building alliances and prompting structural change. So what structural change, you ask? could be the focus for anger. And I think I have, multiple responses, and it would depend on, who is sort of, what sort of sits well with the person on the other side. I think it would be, for me personally, the first thing would be an overhauling of the educational curriculum, something, that teaches us and our children about our difficult, inconvenient, racist histories, so that we see our own privileges and complicities, educating new immigrants to Canada about Canada's racial history, so that we don't buy into white supremacy and perpetuate colonial mythologies and racist stereotypes. Perhaps, in terms of Teresa Tam and, sort of the coverage that I was looking at, I would say a more diverse press room, right? So that diverse stories are told, and told not just from, from the perspective where Asian Canadians or racialized minorities are always victims whose plight is being told, but stories of activism, of advocacy, of triumph, of survival, right? Those kinds of stories too. And for that, you need a diverse press room. I would say perhaps resource and knowledge sharing among different racialized communities and groups, so that they can share their experiences of anger and grief, learn from each other, as well as engage the wider public in call for solidarity and alliance. So I think, there are so many different things we can do to bring about changes in the structure. There's a lot of work to be done, I would say.
I thought some of your most striking evidence in the paper was drawn from some Angus Reid polls, which showed that, majorities of Asian Canadians are changing their daily work patterns so that they steer clear of racists.
Yeah.
And an astonishing number, I think over 60% report having experienced racist comments, and some have been spat upon. And you write, the threat of violence is always lurking under the surface for Asian Canadians. Have you experienced any of this yourself in your work on this and other questions around race?
Well, I'm privileged by class, right? I'm privileged by education. I'm privileged by religion. I'm privileged by heterosexuality. So I'm protected in many, many ways, right? And I have had the privilege of working from home throughout the pandemic, right? And not the same for, say, small businesses which had to close their doors, or say cashiers, retail businesses, etc. So, my experiences are not the same as sort of the work that I am doing, but and I would say, I'm protected, but at the same time, my experience of racism is different, because my research and public advocacy over more than a decade, as you know, has been on the 1985 Air India bombing. I've written lots of op-ed pieces, public facing work, critiquing, Canadian multiculturalism and all of that. So I get my share of hate mail, that says that I should be the grateful, immigrant, and I'm not the grateful immigrant that I am expected to be. So I get my share of that. And then, of course, in the classroom, right? So I teach material which are bringing up hazy histories, inconvenient histories, both for my Canadian-born students, but also for, say, South Asian students in my classroom who grow up with particular versions of histories. So my, sort of take on, say, the partition of British India, or even sort of, Canada, or say the Air India tragedy, often does not match up to the stories that they have heard, being told to them within their families or their communities, right? And at those moments, of course, then my gender, my age, my brown skin, shall we say, produces difficult encounters. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I think one of the major themes that we're seeing from this COVID-19 pandemic has been the intersection of class and race. And, I've been really struck by American studies, the Color of Coronavirus project in the US, which keeps coming up with these just startling statistics of how many more Black Americans are contracting the disease, are dying of the disease. Huge numbers of them don't have health insurance. So basically, Black and Latinx Americans are 3 times as likely as their white neighbors to become infected, and nearly twice as likely to die from the virus. And there are very similar data coming out of the United Kingdom. In Toronto, racialized residents accounted for 83% of cases, although making up just 52% of the population. So I guess a major theme, and you've already alluded to it, but maybe you could say a little bit more, is just the power of class and the job market that is structured so that so many of the highest risk occupations like PSWs, meat packers, migrant agricultural workers are made up of racialized minorities. So I think, I was wondering, as your study of race and COVID-19 goes forward, how much importance will you yourself assign to class as well as race as an element in the subaltern experience of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think, that's a great question, because I don't think we can talk about the differentiated effects of the pandemic without talking about, class, or even gender. The model, minority myth that we talked about in the 1960s, and you brought that up, Ian, as well. It creates, the Asian immigrants as a monolith, but they are, distinguished by class and gender and, the time of their migration, all of that. And the way the pandemic has unfolded, and you brought up UK and US as well as Canada, it has unfolded differently for lower class, racialized or minoritized communities, as I said, not for someone like me who's working from home. So I think class and race are enmeshed in the context of the global pandemic. So I don't think we can talk of one without the other, because it's not just racial subject, but classed racial subjects that are bearing the burden of the global pandemic.
I'm wondering, so much of scholarship buried class as a category of analysis. Sometime in the 1980s, it was no longer fashionable to be interested in labor. It was no longer fashion. And I think maybe that's going to change after this pandemic, because class has just become so obviously a huge structuring fact in people's lives. Life or death matter.
Yeah, and I hope so, right? Because we are designating particular groups of people as essential workers.
Right.
But those essential workers are the ones who are in precarious employment, who are now sort of frontline workers, who are bearing not just the burden of contracting the virus, but also discrimination, racism, no sick benefits, all of those, right? The transportation industry, manufacturing industry, as you said, meat packers, Mexican immigrants who are doing much of the work in Niagara, right? So all of those. So I hope so, because I don't think you can talk about, just race, because that would not give you a full understanding of the context unless we bring in class solidly in that configuration.
So my last question, you've pondered the politics deeply of commemoration. And you really focused especially on the public memory in Canada of Air India Flight 182 in 1985, which blew up with 329 people on board. And yet that came to be sidelined in Canada. It was never really considered a Canadian event. It was sort of seen as something other than that for reasons that you explore very subtly. Never got to be considered a Canadian disaster. It was always something, happening to the others. I sense a kind of parallel, maybe it's not a precise one, between that tragedy and the tragedies that we've been experiencing just this year, in that these events are intrinsically global. They transcend the boundaries of the nation state, yet so much of the apparatus of public history and commemoration remains firmly in the hands of public nation boosters, you could call them, who have often very atavistic ideas about race and belonging. If you ever seen so many references to Churchill as he happened, it's like, Churchill, our great hero, never pondering sort of his ideas about race or his, he's just unqualified, our hero. So they're trying to sort of, drum up a kind of nationalist feeling around the pandemic. So I wondered if you thought about how COVID-19 could be appropriately commemorated, and must these commemorations be inevitably bound up with the complexes of myths and symbols particular to particular nations? Or can we imagine a transnational form of commemoration around COVID-19?
Yeah, maybe I will try to take a stab at your last question first and then come back to the first question, because because even with the Air India tragedy, you talked about like, should it be at the level of the national or should it be global? Even at the level of the Air India tragedy, yes, it's a national tragedy, but it is also a transnational tragedy, right? Because the Air India plane, as the bombs were put in Canada, but the plane did not blow up in Pearson International Airport. It blew up in Irish airspace, right? So there is an Irish memorial and Irish investment in the tragedy, and then many of the Air India family, not many, some of the Air India family members who were Canadians just could not live in Canada anymore after they had lost their entire family. Many have gone back to India and they do nonprofit work there. So it's a Canadian tragedy, it's also an Indian tragedy, and it's also an Irish tragedy, right? And on that plane, there were also other people. There were some British, some German, etc. Right? So it is, a national tragedy, but also a global tragedy. And I think the same could and should apply to this pandemic, knowing that this is a global pandemic, and we can see similar kinds of, treatments of minorities, across, the North America and beyond. And I am, I've been deeply interested in questions of public memory and cultural history, questions of what gets scaled up to the level of the national or the global, and what always stays at the level of the local. And with the global pandemic, I think the losses are multifaceted. Many have died quietly, many have been grieving in isolation, many families have not been able to perform last rites and rituals that provide solace to the families. Many have not been able to see family members who died in another city or died in another country. So I think it will be important to remember those losses, those who died without an appropriate, funeral or memorial service, and their families and friends. But there have been other kinds of losses too, losses of jobs, losses of employment, housing. And I will say, the loss of national belonging. If you think of the anti-Asian, racism that we are talking about, and the effects of that has on mental health, the racial grief of non-belonging, feeling non-secure in your citizenship. I mean, those are losses too, and deep losses that, is not just bound within the family, but, spills over into communities and children and transgenerational, memories. So the losses are multiple, I think. It is a public health crisis that has demonstrated the inequities in our societies. And we have to acknowledge all these different kinds of losses if we are going to learn from this critical moment of history. So I think there cannot be one way to commemorate this, because it's shared losses, but some losses are also very particular, as we know.
I wonder
so that would be my response. Yeah.
I wonder if a very optimistic reading of the crisis we've gone through is maybe it's been a harsh lesson in global citizenship, that we have to almost acknowledge our common humanity with people all around the planet, because we are now, and it's that we're in these new interconnected units that in many ways national boundaries don't make the same sense that they used to make even 40 years ago. This is sort of graphically demonstrated. You can keep thinking that way, but you actually are being almost forced to change your mind, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I keep saying that if there is one thing that COVID-19 has taught us, or perhaps should teach us, is how interdependent we are, right? I can be well if my neighbor is well. I can be well if the person I'm sharing the public transit with, right, is well. So I can be well if the person that I'm working in the office with and who shares the cubicle with me as well. So sort of the interdependence has become so critical. And so I hope a better awareness, a better understanding of our interdependence and our shared coexistence, right? Perhaps that could be a lesson.
Okay, I think that's a great way to end our conversation. I wonder now if you would accept a few questions from our audience.
Sure, please.
Something. And how you folks are probably a bit more conversant with Zoom than I will ever be. After a year of trying to use it, it's perpetually stumped me. But there is a little command that you can go to under participants, I believe it is, and you raise your yellow hand. And you raise a yellow hand, and that lets us know, or else you can do it the old-fashioned way and just make a noise and gesture. Okay. Ruth, am I seeing a hand? Yes.
Hi, I mean, I share those hopes, the emphasis on interdependence and the hope that that might lead to things that are very positive, but vaccine nationalism is so intense. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of India, like, what's happening in India and how sort of, there's not enough vaccines. As you know, there's some close friends that I have lost as a result of COVID-19 who just could not make it to the hospital because there were not enough beds and ventilators living in the capital city of Delhi. Right. So yes, the conversations about, I'm not a medical physician, but the conversations about AstraZeneca, and now AstraZeneca is going to be, sent out. And there are also, concerns about children. So I don't think that there will be a desire to share until, countries have made sure that their own populations have been vaccinated. So, I mean, that seems to be even as you said, even as we are aware that unless, globally everybody is vaccinated, we are not safe because, it mutates and the variants that are coming in. But I don't know if people would be willing to put their, folks at risk or supposed risk and be philanthropic. So there's a line where philanthropy ends or begins perhaps, right? So
it reminds me not just the classes coming back into as a topic of analysis, but so is imperialism. And what, so much of what happened in India, it was reminiscent in a way of imposed famines by the imperial power going back, a century.
Also misgovernance, yeah. We can't just, blame imperialism,
Right.
Intense misgovernance by the Indian government.
Right.
Right. So, complete mismanagement, right? But also it's about money, as you say, and it's also about finance, like which countries, of course, the developed countries have the money to buy the vaccines, right? So, questions of patents and, how do we make it accessible? Those are all, questions, yeah.
Justin, you have a question.
Hello. Yes, sorry, I'm not sure. I'm having some camera difficulties here.
Well, your day is great.
Seems to be the, there we go. You made a few comments earlier in your talk about needing to modify our teaching and needing to modify education. And so I've TA'd here at McMaster for I think up to four years now, and something I know many of us have observed, particularly when we're teaching introductory classes for first-year students, and we have a lot of international students. And as we all tend to do, we tend to group with the people that we recognize as coming from the same background as us. And so that does tend to create this division within when you've got a lecture hall of 200 students and you're hoping to get the students interacting with one another, even in a tutorial of 30 students, and they're all kind of going off into their groups. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations on what we as educators can be doing in the classroom to be combating that and to be in the sense of so that we're actively working to not promote those kinds of divisions, if that question makes sense?
Somewhat, because I don't know how much you can, it brings up questions of structural change that Ian asked, right? That unless sort of the structures on the outside change, can you as a TA in one classroom do that change, right? Because then the question to ask is, why does that happen? Why do, certain groups of, people based whether on religion or ethnicities, why do they, hang out together? What kinds of, comfort it allows, what kinds of conversations that makes possible, and how do we widen that space so that there is a conversation and between. I guess, one way of doing that might be through just materials that we put in the course, right? Can we, have a conversation, say, between Black Lives Matter and anti-Asian racism, right? So that we are not talking of, this week is my, Black Studies class. Next week, I will do my South Asia. And then the third week, I will do my Indigenous, and I'm done, right? I have done my three EDI groups, and, my courses, I've taken care of it. But if we can, build in those conversations throughout the course, so that we are not replicating those divisions that we are seeing in the classroom in our course. And if we can, bring out those intersections, perhaps some, the students will also see their intersections, that yes, it might be race, but it's also gender. And, I might not have racial kinship with somebody, but I might have class kinship, right? Or I might have the same kind of, immigration history, or same kind of education, interests. And so I think we can prompt them, but I don't know how much you can do solo in a class, but it's worth a try, I guess.
I guess really, yeah, I guess you said it much better than what I was trying to articulate. Was yes, well, what can we be doing to be prompting that, so that we're part of the solution as opposed to contributing to a larger problem?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, the better attention to the structure of the course, right? Both in terms of the materials that we put, and perhaps how we divide up the class, right? So when we do sort of say group work, can we sort of mix and match a little bit? And also perhaps if you see a lot of people hanging together, maybe they have something to share. Could we open up opportunities so that students also see themselves as knowledge creators and not just knowledge recipients? That might be a way to also create cross conversations, perhaps. I'm just thinking aloud here. I can see a number of people in the call who have way more teaching experience than I have, Ken and Karen and others. And I'm, please feel free to suggest other ways of doing things. I see Karen's hand up.
Karen.
Thanks, Chandrima, for, as always, giving me so much to think about. Back to Justin, be of good hope. Because I was beyond impressed with the way the students in my first year gender studies class this year were able to make sustained connections across conversations about COVID care work, labor migration, missing and murdered Indigenous women, gendered Islamophobia. They saw it, like they saw it together. But that kind of comes to what I really wanted to ask you about, Chandrima, which is something I've been thinking about as I've watched both COVID and activism in Hamilton over the last year. And one of the things I've noticed is that in this darkest of times, I've seen the development of this truly kind of impressive and amazing interconnected analysis coming mostly from youth activists in Hamilton who have said health justice is home, health justice is home, is houselessness justice, is disability justice, is defund police, is colonialism, is Palestine, is land back. And we also have the example of the Just Recovery, the coalition of groups in Hamilton that came together to produce the Just Recovery report. Now, none of that actually flips a switch and magically all those problems are changed. But I have been thinking about the ways in which there's just this kick-ass group of activists in Hamilton who are seeing connections. I know they're not the only ones, but I've seen it in this city. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that, the moment of despair and the moment of, I guess, anger that produces change happening simultaneously.
Yeah, I think, I am a pessimist who's also an optimist. And, I take a lot of lesson from, Roger Simon, critical pedagogy scholar, who was doing, with his amazing work on historical memory and trauma, but he kept holding on to hope, hope of, justice, the possibility of justice through public education. And I take a lot, I read his work a lot, and I go back and reread his work a lot as well, because it's sort of, bell hooks, Roger Simon, sort of the critical pedagogy scholars, they inspire me so much because I see the classroom as a site of radical possibility. And as you said, the youth, I mean, they are the next generation. I mean, they are the ones who will, take the conversations forward and, will have a say in terms of the collective future, right? However it's envisioned. And there's a lot to be hopeful for, as you say, the work that we've seen in, Hamilton, the work that I see with youth helping, elders in the community to just book vaccine appointments or, take them for vaccine appointments. The role that these youth vaccine ambassadors that public health has appointed are doing. So I think we have a lot to be hopeful about. So it is, it's terrible and it seems catastrophic, but there are, seedlings, seedlings that are growing, which will mature into big trees that will shade themselves and us.
I'm reminded, Antonio Gramsci, pessimism of the intelligence, optimism of the will, right? So,
That's true.
I think we're in a moment of deep crisis in which so many of our presuppositions and assumptions about the world around us have been shaken. And many conventional ideological grooves have been kind of upset, and people have now, what emerges from that is going to be decisive in the next year. Is like, will those people retreat back to their quest for normality? Do they just really want to go back to the way the world was? Or can they retain what you've tried to convey to them about, say, the deep structures of racism or the deep structures of class or the deep structures of, can they retain those insights and work on them? And I think that's still really an open question. Like, this is what Gramsci would call an organic crisis of the ruling order. And right now it's, it's a tremendous moment of opportunity and of danger, right?
And also, I'll just add, the community activism that we've seen, right? Like in response to anti-Asian racism that has been also provided by social media. And often, the organizing is by the youth. Some of the roundtables that McMaster has organized, often led by PhD students and others, right? So there is a groundswell, but but we also seem to be moving from crisis to crisis, right? It's Black lives, and then it's anti-Asian racism, then it's Indigenous children. So it's overwhelming, right? Like we seem to be constantly moving from grief to grief to grief, right? So it's as Ian said, crisis in so many different ways, right? Like as we are grappling with the past, but the question also is like, is the past, but what about how, the past shapes our presence and the presence of the past, right? So for some, the past resides in textbooks and maybe monuments and museums. But what if the past is your daily presence, right? How, sort of how it seeps into your life, and therefore the long history of racism or the long history of classism or the long history of sexism all needs to be grappled with, disturbing or inconvenient as they might be. But unless you acknowledge those histories and recognize those, I don't know how you can move along with it or beyond it.
Very well put. Well, I think, Chandrima, it's been a wonderful session. I'm not seeing there. Right. If anyone has a further question, this would be the time to raise it. Otherwise, I think we should let Chandrima have our appreciation for a very thoughtful presentation.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
And thank you very much for joining us. And I really hope that your optimism is borne out in the year to come.
You're all optimists with me. You're all working together towards, right? Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ian, for this opportunity. It was lovely. Thank you.
Bye.